Alexa, stop. Okay, can people hear me? Not if you can hear me. Yeah? Okay, good. All right, so I will go ahead and get started. So first, I'll introduce myself. Everyone's on mute, so I can't hear you. If you want to say something, then put it in the chat, and I'll try to read through the chat in a little while. All right, so in fact, here, Becky, I'm going to unmute you. And then, let me see if I can find you. So Becky, I've just unmuted you. Can you please confirm?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay, all right, so can you monitor the chat? And if there's questions, then when I ask if there's questions, then you can tell me. Is that good?
That sounds
All
good.
right.
Do you want people to be able to raise their hands also if they
Sure.
want? Okay, so.
But you tell me, because I'm not gonna watch that.
So I'll monitor that. So participants, if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, you click on participants at the bottom of your screen, and there's a button that says raise hand. And then when you raise your hand like that, see how I have a little hand? Then the hands comes up, and then you can lower your hand. So that's another way. So you could send in a chat, or you could raise your hand. Okay.
Okay. So great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So as most of you know, I'm an epidemiologist with a couple of decades of experience now. I worked at the infectious disease clinic at UNC Chapel Hill when I was pursuing my doctorate in epidemiology down there. And I have a lot of experience. I've been spending many years forecasting disease trends globally and working to prioritize medical research so we can help those with the greatest need based on the forecasts that we do for healthcare and for various disease areas. So the reason that I'm doing this is not to give you privileged information that I don't have in terms of what drug might be the best out there or when this whole thing will end. Instead, what I'm trying to do is to reduce anxiety by helping you to better understand the things that epidemiologists are thinking about. So when we read the studies that are coming out, when we're looking and thinking among ourselves, what will the course of this look like? I can tell you the types of questions that we're asking ourselves and the evidence that's starting to accumulate in different ways. That's really interesting. I don't have final answers for a lot of things, but I think that by going through the process, you understand how epidemiologists are thinking, that will help you to have a better understanding of COVID-19 and I think will relieve anxiety, hopefully, among people. All right, so I'm gonna start sharing my screen. So what I'd like to do is focus on therapies for today. So basically, the therapies that are being developed, as well as the vaccine trials that are going on. I can answer any question in a little while, but I want to start just talking about the therapies because we've all been under lockdown for a while, and so this is going to be some of the most pressing questions, I think, that are coming up in terms of what's been the new trials that have been going on, in terms of the new drugs that are going to be available and the new vaccines. So I'm going to start just first by describing just basic epidemiology. How do clinical trials work? All right, so let's say that we had a quarters game. Okay, here's the quarters game. There are two players in the quarters game. The way the quarters game works is if you have a quarter, if you throw it in the air and catch it, if you get a heads, then one person wins, and if you get a tail, then the other person wins. In this game, we currently have two players. We're gonna throw up the coin once, a single time. If it is heads, then little Timmy wins, and if it's tails, then little Janie wins. Does everyone understand the rules of the game? You throw up the quarter, and if it's heads, little Timmy wins. If it's tails, then little Janie wins. All right, so we're gonna throw it up in the air and see who wins. Little Janie won, it was tails. Janie won. Congratulations, little Janie. The interesting thing is that there is always a winner in this game. Either little Janie or little Timmy was going to win. All right, let's play this game again, but make it slightly more complicated. Now, instead of tossing it once, let's toss it twice. All right, and so the first time, little Janie will play against little Johnny, and little Timmy will play against little Susie. If it's heads, when little Johnny plays against little Janie, then little Johnny wins if it's heads. And if it's heads, when little Susie plays against little Timmy, then little Susie will win. All right, so you all understand the rules of the game. Let's see what happens in the first round. They're gonna throw up the coin once and see what happens. Little Johnny won and little Susie won. Yay! All right, so now they compete. This is the next time that they're throwing up the coin for the playoff to see who wins in the 2-coin series. And they throw up the coin. And oh, by the way, in this next one, if it's heads, then little Johnny wins. If it's tails, then little Susie wins. So let's see who wins. It's heads. Little Johnny wins the trophy. Yay! That's with 4 players. Now I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated. All right, this is with 8 players. Now there's too many players, so I'm not going to go through people's names, but these are all the different combinations when you have different 8 different players. It's the same type of thing that we were looking at with 4 players, where it's just 2 people competing against each other each time, and then you have lots of different possibilities. And in terms of the combinations that we're looking at, you know, I noticed something interesting. In the ones where there's a box, each of those have 1 head and then 2 tails. And so I don't really care what the combination is. I'm just gonna group those together because it's 1 head, 2 tails. That's good enough for me. And then similarly, you can see here, these have 2 heads each and 1 tail each. So I'm grouping them together just to make it a little easier to see. And so in terms of probability, someone winning heads 8 times in a row, there's a 1 in 8 chance that that's gonna happen. And it turns out little Janie won. Yay, little Janie. And so the more times you do this, the more times you have lots of different possibilities. Let's say you had over 1,000 players. Even with 1,000 players, if it's 1 in 1,000, 1,024s, it would turn out here if you play it 10 different times. With that many players, despite the number of players, you know that 1 person is going to win. And it's not that that person is anything special. It's not that the person is magic. You just know based on the way that the quarters work, that it's 50-50 chance either way, that you know someone is going to ultimately be a winner and have all heads. Every single time that they did it against their competitor, someone at the end, we don't know who that person is at the beginning, but we can be 100% certain someone at the end is going to win all those heads. So in this case, with over 1,000 players, let's see who the winner was. So there it is. So there's 1 in over 1,000 chance of getting all heads because they just happen to get all heads. Little Timmy wins. All right, so here's the moral of this is why I'm showing you all this. And this is why it's so important. Because if you understand this concept that I just described, then you understand 80% of statistics, and you understand 80% of what every epidemiologist is thinking about with the medicines that we're all looking at in clinical trials. So for instance, this first malarial drug that we heard about. Well, before I get there, let me just do a couple more slides. All right, so one thing that you notice, so I had grouped these together. Basically, the ones on the edge are much, much less common. So it's very, very rare to have it. But you know that if you were to throw the coin 1,000 times, you're going to end up with some of these. Similarly, with almost any drug out there, if you were to just test 1,000 drugs that have no possible influence on the disease, they don't help the disease at all, you know just by studying all these different drugs and thousands of different drugs that 1 in 1,000, based on this distribution, you'd expect would be a positive, that you'd expect it to show amazing, amazing results, even though in reality, there was nothing special about it. The quarter, there was nothing special about little Timmy. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time based on the number of people. And so in particular, when you have study designs with small numbers of participants, 10, 20, 30, 40 people, then it's very easy to have a trial that looks like it's amazingly successful, when in reality, there's nothing special about it at all. It just happens just based on random chance alone that you're going to have it look successful. And so ultimately, all right, so that's what I just said. So ultimately, what you have is a distribution, and you have let's call this yellow line, that there's no effect. So that means that every drug out there, every trial that you do is likely to fall somewhere in terms of how effective it is. Most of them are going to be on the yellow line and not be effective at all. But hopefully some that we study will be effective. The green box, when we first start doing trials, we don't know which is going to be effective or not at first. All we know are which are effective in those small trials. So we need to do repeated trials across lots and lots of different people, with expanding the number of people. And that's the only way we can see if the distribution is yellow, where there's actually no impact, or it's green, where it's actually an effective drug. And this is the reason why when epidemiologists look at the preliminary results for some of these drugs, we know, the vast majority of drugs that turn out to not be effective because they're on the yellow line are going to look effective when you first try them. Because just by randomness alone, if you have thousands of trials, obviously you can imagine that there are thousands of hospitals all over the world treating these COVID-19 patients right now. And every single one of them is trying to do what's best for their patient. And so simply by rolling the dice so many times, you're going to get all these positive trials. Like, oh, wow, this drug works, this drug works. As an epidemiologist, we know, well, it's too early. Just because you see positive trials doesn't tell you anything about whether it actually works or not. And so you need to actually do additional trials to see if it's effective or not. And so what we're seeing is that among these trials, yeah, it's likely that among the ones that are successful at first, some subset of those are the ones that might ultimately be successful. So maybe this malaria drug might work, maybe it won't. We don't know yet. It's too early, because we know just by chance alone it's going to fall, and some of these drugs are going to end up being looking successful. All right, just a couple other things to say about the malaria drug before I go forward. So first, okay, so this drug has been used for malaria and also for lupus. The average age for people with malaria is typically like young kids, who are frequently the ones who are infected. And a common side effect of this malarial drug is it increases the risk of heart attacks. Well, for kids, the risk of heart attacks is really, really, really small, because heart attacks you don't typically see in people until they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, you see it earlier, but it's much more common the older that people get. And so with kids, the risk is extremely, extremely small. And so if you increase the risk of heart attacks among kids, then instead of it being extremely, extremely small, then it's only extremely small, not extremely, extremely. And so because of this, it's okay to use as a malarial drug because it's very safe in that population. Similarly with lupus, it tends to be older than the young kids, but you test for it and you look to see people who are at high risk for heart attacks, and you don't give people who are at high risk for heart attacks that disease. The problem with this drug used for this disease is that the ones who are at the highest risk of dying of heart attacks and lung consequences, these people who have pre-existing heart conditions, diabetes, and these other comorbidities, and who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, these people are at the highest risk of heart attacks. So if you give them a drug where it increases the risk of a heart attack even more, then it's not the case of having no impact. Like, should we, because this question comes up, well, if you have a 70-year-old that's in the hospital with COVID-19, shouldn't we at least try? So let's look at the screen. I mean, if it's one of these other drugs where we don't know if it's just tending to be a false positive or if it's ultimately going to be a good drug, just because it's available, shouldn't we give them something instead of just letting them suffer without giving them any drug? And so the reality is that a lot of people would say, no, we shouldn't give them any drug, because if we give them a drug like this malarial drug, then you might actually make them worse off, because they're already fighting for their lives. Many of these people in the hospital, they're already fighting for their lives. And if you gave them a drug on top of that, that made it more likely for them to have a heart attack, then you make it even harder for them to survive. So that's why epidemiologists, when we look at these studies, we say, no, the evidence isn't there yet. Don't give them the drug because the evidence isn't there yet. The problem is that it becomes a social issue. And so if you're a physician and you see one of these early outcomes and you want to do everything you can for your patient, then you might try it with your patient. And they might be likely to be okay. Maybe they didn't have a heart attack and die. So you say, okay, we'll do it again. Once people start doing it, for instance, once the President of the United States starts saying, you know, I think this drug is going to be effective, let's give it to everyone. Then the problem is if you're a physician in a hospital and you have people in the waiting room who are crying because they want to see their 80-year-old mother who's in the hospital at risk of death, and they ask the doctor, what are you doing for her? Then the doctor wants to be able to say something. And if the doctor is one of those that's not giving this malarial drug to the patient, then it makes the doctor seem like they're incompetent, that they're not doing cutting edge medicine because they're not doing what's becoming the standard of care, where the physicians are giving this drug to everyone. And that's just become the socially acceptable thing to do. The worry is, from an epidemiology perspective, the evidence isn't there yet. And that's why we're holding off on making these clinical recommendations. And that's why it's not helpful when someone like the President of the United States says, oh, we should be using this drug more often. Because a drug like the malaria drug that people are talking about, or different analogs similar to it for the same that have the same type of issues, can cause death themselves. Regardless of anything else, the drugs can kill you. And so we have to remember this. And so when it comes, I'm not going to talk about any specific drugs, but in general, when we're looking at this, this is why studies take so long. This is why studies can easily take many weeks or months to try to figure out, because we don't want to kill people. And so the only way to figure out the course of which drugs actually work is to go through the exercise of this long trial, so to really figure out, is it just a statistical fluke, or is it actually something that's going to work? And so really, if anyone gets sick and goes to the hospital and says, please, please give me this malarial drug, that's not necessarily the best course of action for you. So trust what your physicians are saying. And the problem is a lot of physicians themselves don't have good epidemiology training. And so physicians are looking at what other physicians are doing. And if some of the early physicians started using the malarial drug, then that itself is probably the reason a lot of other physicians out there are doing it. Because right now the evidence isn't that great. The initial studies were really poorly conducted. And it turned out that some of them got really severe disease. Some of the people who were treated with this got really severe disease. Others died. And that's wasn't really heavily reported in the news. So right now, the date is Sunday, April 12th. And, you know, we could find out that some more studies get reported Monday or later this week. And then everything I'm saying to you would have to be then reevaluated based on the new evidence of the new clinical trials being reported. But for now, as I speak, the evidence isn't fully in yet. So we can't just start giving these drugs to everyone because you don't want to kill them all. All right, that's enough of that. Next, all right, so that's too much math. I'm going to get into this one. So basically, now that I've told you about the virus, okay, in terms of like the drug, like these malarial drugs, one of the early impacts that they were looking at was the viral load. And here's a study, I think this was from Germany, I don't remember. It was published in The Lancet March 8th, and it was looking at the course of the disease. And so here, what they found is that among survivors, what you found is that there was very high viral shedding at the very beginning of the course of the disease. Even before people had symptoms, there was viral shedding, maybe 2 days before. So 2 days to the start of symptoms, there was a lot of viral shedding that was going on. And then even after the symptoms started, those first 5-6 days after the symptoms started, then there was quite a lot of viral shedding. And so the symptoms that typically came at that point were maybe fever, cough. As the days progressed among the severe patients, then you got additional symptoms. But you'll notice that viral shedding started going down very rapidly. And so if you look at the ICU admission, so the ones who are going into intensive care, the viral shedding had actually gone down a lot before they even went into intensive care. And so what this means is that a medicine that's meant to deal with the virus is not even going to be so effective potentially for people in intensive care. Because at that point, what happens is that you get this, what's known as a cytokine storm. And so you get people who really just, it's the immune system that takes over. And so I was mentioning, I was on a call a little earlier today, and I was telling people the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is the same virus that's infecting everyone around the world. What's different that makes some people have symptoms and other people have no symptoms, and some people have such severe symptoms that it kills them, the only difference between the people is something about the people themselves, about their immune systems, about their physiology. It's not the virus, because it's the identical virus. And so what this means is that, okay, even if we reduce the viral load, so if we look at the time from no symptoms when there is some virus to the early disease when there's higher virus but not very many symptoms early on, then when it's early in the disease, that would be a good time to maybe focus if we find some good antivirals. And that could be a way to prevent this acute respiratory disease syndrome, this ARDS, usually called ARDS. And so that would be a good time. The problem is that by the time a lot of people go into the hospital, the virus is already, for many people, there's already so little virus that's shedding, the symptoms are its own disease. And so that means that we would start, the types of drugs that we would start to be looking at are not antivirals at all. The type of drugs would be immunomodulatory drugs that are called. So for instance, the TNF alpha, that's tumor necrosis factor alpha, the interleukins like interleukin 1, interleukin 6, etc. These are all things that reduce inflammation and really address the cytokine storm. This is what would be needed at that point to reduce lung and heart damage, because at that point, it's almost not even a virus issue. At that point, it's really an immune system issue. And so there's different types of drugs that you would be considering at different stages of the disease. And so that means that in terms of what drug will be best that will help us, there's probably not going to be a single drug that's the best drug that we need to look at. The other thing is that sometimes people are talking about with HIV as an analog. In HIV, there have been effective treatments on the market for many, many years now. And because so many people have been treated with this drug, we know the safety profile already really well. And so a bunch of years ago, maybe a few years ago at this point, I think a little longer than that, there was a new strategy that came out called PrEP. And PrEP was a lower dose of some of the same medicines that are out there for HIV that physicians prescribe to people who have no HIV, but it's prescribed prophylactically to prevent them from getting the virus. And it's been proven to be extremely effective. So some people have said, well, could we find some antivirals for this disease that would prevent even getting the virus in the first place? And the problem with that is that because the antivirals that we're investigating have not been out, either they have been out and they're like the malarial drugs, they're really toxic, and that would be a reason not to give them to the population at large. Or if there's new drugs that are being developed, sort of these novel therapeutics, then we don't have enough experience with them. We don't know what the impact will be if you start giving them to millions of people. So it's going to be very hard to imagine a scenario in which there's suddenly some new antiviral that's identified that we would start giving to people prophylactically and start giving to millions. Because what we could see is that the drug could be even worse than the disease. And instead of the most severely ill people, we might end up with a lot of very healthy people who are suddenly needing to go to the hospital and potentially dying. So we probably would not be looking at a prophylactic anytime soon, from just what I'm looking at. Things might change depending on how things evolve, but for now, the sum of evidence would need to be extremely high to be looking at something like that. All right, let me see. Okay, I'm gonna unmute all. Are there any questions so far about what I just said? let me see how I unmute all. Or let me mute all except for Becky. And then Becky, you write in chat if there's anything. Whoops.
So maybe
Right.
call on those people individually first.
Can you list out a name?
Okay, Anne and
All right.
Dan Rodriguez.
Okay, and Dan Rodriguez. Oh wait, I have to unmute them, don't I? Ha. Is there a way to do this in alphabetical order? All right. I don't know how to do that.
So maybe mute everybody and ask Anne and Dan Rodriguez to
Oh,
unmute
here's Anne. I see. I'm sorry. I'm still new to Zoom. I use other things. All right, Anne. I think I can hear you.
I'm not talking.
Oh, wait, now you are. Oh, is it the wrong Anne? Did you, Anne? Did you raise your hand by accident?
No.
Okay, sorry.
No.
All right. All right. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Thank you, Glenn, for this explanation of the therapeutic testing process and the stages of the coronavirus here. Of the treatments that are available out there, a lot has been said of the Gilead drugs that are available. If we get comprehensive testing and we get something like the antivirals working, where we don't get into the later stages of the disease, is that an upside scenario that could be that could come to pass? And what kind of timing are we looking at? So because Gilead,
Yeah.
talking about their phase 2, phase 3, they're trying to speed it up. I looked at the timing of all the drugs. The FDA definitely has been picking up the pace. They have been approving drugs much more rapidly over the last 18 months than they have in the past. But even so, the timelines do seem to be more than what the market is kind of projecting, and definitely more than what the administration seems to be projecting in some of these briefings.
So I'm optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is because there are so many trials going on right now. I think that some of them will prove successful. The problem is going to be that I don't think that there's going to be one universal drug that's good for everyone. And so the question is, so with an antiviral, when do we start? So in fact, I can tell you a little bit more. I'm going to put you back on mute, Dan.
Yep.
All right, if I can figure out. All right, give me 1 second. All right, so the story is, oh yeah. So the story is that the way that this virus evolved was in bats. And it's really interesting because we're finding out a lot more about the bats now. And so with the bats, they have a much more complicated immune system in some ways than humans do. And so there's a very specific receptor that this virus attaches to in people. And we only have a couple versions of this receptor. In contrast, bats have an extremely large number of these types of receptors. And so because of that, and this was one way, it's been like an arms race in the bat against coronavirus and other viruses like this. And so because of this arms race, unlike some other viruses out there, what's interesting about coronavirus is that it tries to replicate as fast as it possibly can at first. And so that means that it ramps up really fast. And that means even during the asymptomatic phase, it's ramping up as much as it possibly can at first, because in bats, it had to try to evade the immune system faster than the bats could respond to it. And because there were not a lot of cells, a lot of receptors available, it's boosted the number of times it replicated even faster than normal. And so in people, it's replicating very, very fast at first. So in the first week, even when people are asymptomatic, there tends to be a viral load that's detectable. And then as in the early parts of the disease, even before there's a lot of symptoms, it's a very high viral load compared to some other diseases that might be out there. And so the viral load starts, so people start producing antibodies on their own to deal with it. But the problem is that it's almost too late for a lot of people. So the question is, who would you give an antiviral to, and when would you start it? Usually the ones who would be getting the antivirals, the treaters who would be getting the antivirals, are probably the hospitals and the ones with the severest cases at first. And the problem is those severe cases who might be in their second or third week of the disease might be the least likely to benefit from it. And so really trying to match the right drug with the right patient could be a real logistical problem, because identifying those patients could be really hard. As we break lockdown and we have good test and trace in place, then we might be able to identify these candidates earlier on in the life cycle of the disease, or the course of the disease, who would be good candidates, because at that point they'll still have very minimal disease, they'll have been diagnosed, maybe they won't even have symptoms at that point, and that might be a good candidate to give them a drug like this. But so when it comes to the antivirals, one of the biases almost in terms of looking at this disease is that in the test tube and in animal models, but particularly in a test tube or petri dish, you can take a drug, put it in the petri dish, and see if it reduces viral activity. And because we've done so much great science over the last decades in biology and chemistry and doing a lot of lab science on petri dishes, we have a bias towards drugs typically for viruses that focus on antivirals, like in a test tube. The problem is that immunomodulatory drugs, like the anti-tumor necrosis factor, interleukins, et cetera, if you put that into the test tube or that into the petri dish, it's not going to impact the virus at all because it's not an antiviral drug. That does something in a different part of the body, which means that even the drugs that we're looking at, many of the antivirals, like the Gilead drug, are going to be focusing early on at the antivirals. And so it's not clear when you actually put it into a clinical trial, what will the clinical impact be? And so that's still an open question. That's why there's a wide diversity of different therapeutic options that we're looking at, including antivirals, but also including other immunomodulatory things. In terms of the type of drugs that we're looking at, so antivirals at a high level are definitely something that would be interesting. Antimodulatory drugs are something that are interesting. In addition, so there's monoclonal antibodies, which are also being investigated. Those are sort of, well, they can be used in a bunch of different things. There are monoclonal antibodies that are out there that can be used to address the immunomodulatory component of it. And then there's also the antibodies that can be produced that directly attach to the virus itself and have antiviral activity. So that's interesting because these monoclonal antibodies are some of the most powerful, most recent biotech that we've been seeing for a lot of different diseases out there. And so that's something that's an interesting area that's being evaluated. The other thing is sort of convalescent plasma people have been talking about. That's a little bit riskier. So basically, some people have been talking about this before. It's been looked at in China for COVID-19. It's been used for other diseases. Basically, what people do is the physicians take blood from people who have recovered, who presumably have antibodies. They take out the red blood cells and just keep only the plasma. And in the plasma are all the antibodies that a person has accumulated, and they should have quite a lot of antibodies if they had a recent disease, the recent COVID-19, and have recovered. Then what they do is they take that and they inject it into someone who's very sick. And presumably that will then dramatically reduce the viral load. And we know this works because it's been used for quite a long time for a lot of infections. The problem is when you do that, you're taking everything in the blood, even things you don't want. So for instance, what if someone has hepatitis C and they didn't realize, and you take their blood and you give it to someone else, and now this person, yeah, they're cured from this virus, but now they suddenly have hepatitis C or other things. It's a really potentially dangerous therapy as well. And so because of that, it's not very specific to treating this disease. And so because of that, there's this worry about what the consequences might be otherwise. So it is absolutely still being investigated. So maybe for the sickest patients, that would be an option. But for now, and so even within that, some people have been talking about, well, maybe we could take that plasma and then reduce it even more to just really pull out the antibodies itself. And then we'd have a more concentrated dose that we can give them without risking having some of this other contamination in there. That's definitely an area that's still evolving. We're not sure yet. All right, Beck, anyone else? Becky, are you on mute? I might have unmuted. All right, Beck.
Yep.
Okay. So is there anyone else?
Letter next.
All right. Otherwise, whoops. Otherwise, I can talk about some other things.
Can you?
Oops. Give me 1 second. I'm having technical difficulties. I'm going to have to give me 1 second. All right, can you see my screen okay? Okay, good. Let me hear, Beck, can you hear me? Oh, you're suddenly muted again. All right, Becky, I can hear, can I? Okay.
We have a question from Deborah Weisletter. Can you unmute Deborah?
All right, I shall try. I think next time I might make 2 monitors so you have the authority to do this because I'm not sure. All right, Deborah, let's see. Deborah, can you raise your hand? It looks like people who have raised hands are coming to the top. Debbie, can you raise your hand?
Okay, so I'll ask you her question.
Okay, that sounds good.
Know about there's the drug trial in Israel, and if you can talk a bit about what's happening in Israel and specific.
So I'm not super familiar with the drug trials in particular, because at this point, as you can imagine, there are many drug trials that have started up on a lot of different candidates, and so they're proliferating as much as the virus is almost at this point. So I'm going to stay away from any specific trial just because I haven't been following them so much. I don't know the specifics, but trials are all within the sphere of epidemiology. So if you want to find out about clinical trials, then you would go to an epidemiology program. So I can answer things generally about clinical trials, and every clinical trial is going to be the same type of thing. The problem is, even if you have a good antiviral that shows good promise, you're still going to need to track those people for a week time just to see if there's a benefit there. And that means that if you want something to show that something is statistically significant in a way that's also clinically significant, then that means that you might need to really be conducting these trials for months at a time, maybe not months, but even if you fast track it as much as you can, you could easily be talking, even with 1,000 people or more people who are enrolled, you could easily be talking about a trial that lasts more than a month, more than a few months. And so that's why these things take time. What I can do is next talk about vaccines. I wanted to get into that. All right, I'm going to jump over this. All right, let me go to this slide. All right, so basically vaccine candidates. The thing, antibodies are really, really interesting. So whenever you have a virus, let's assume that this elephant is a virus that we're looking at. And some antibodies might form on one part of the virus, and some antibodies might form on a different part of the virus. And so depending on the antibody that you have, typically you have a diversity of antibodies that might address a virus. Some antibodies might look at it and say, oh, look, it's a spear that you're looking at. It might just take the tusk and just focus. And anytime they see anything in the body that looks like a tusk, then they'll grab it and start the immune response and get rid of it. Other antibodies might look at a different part of the virus and say, oh, look, it's a big ear. And if they see anything that looks like a big ear, then they'll grab it and remove it from the body. And so the problem is, so that you'll have all these different possible antibodies that you could identify as potentially having an impact. With a typical virus, they have the shell that's on them. And so, so there's not as much diversity that's available. And so that's one way, the more homogeneous the shell is, then in some ways it's a way for it to evade the body seeing it. The more diversity there was on the shell, then the more antibodies could address it and pull it out of the body. So with antibody candidates, then all of these companies, at this point, there's dozens of companies in different countries that are looking at various antibodies. And so each of them are developing slightly different things. Some companies might be developing it for a trunk or the tusk or the thick legs and different parts of the virus. And so because of that, they might have different effectiveness. And so what we're hearing about are, when you talk about vaccines and when you read in the news about vaccines being identified, they're really vaccine candidates. And each one of these will have to be tested in the population. The big problem, and this is a huge, huge problem, but so in SARS, people started looking at these antibodies for the coronavirus that produce SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome. And what they found is that a subset of the antibodies actually called these things called AIDS. And so this is something that you might be reading about more, these antibody-dependent enhancement. It's not the same thing as HIV/AIDS. This is instead ADE. This is an antibody-dependent enhancement. And what happens here is that an antibody is developed and then it stimulates the immune system, but it actually triggers a response that actually harms the body. And so you don't want to create an antibody that, instead of it preventing mortality and preventing severe disease, you actually increase even more the risk of death. This is huge in SARS. And so it's a major, major concern. Because the coronavirus is related to SARS, a lot of us are expecting that there will be ADEs that are going to be coming out of these vaccines. So that means that a bunch of these candidates might be generating these ADEs. So we don't want to release a vaccine too quickly. It comes back to this question, well, what's the point? If we're at risk and we're under lockdown, can't we try it? Even if there's a chance at all that it'll work, can't we try it? And the reason has to be no, because these ADEs can kill people. So you don't want to release it to the general population until you test it. And so, thousands of people are going to need to be tested to make sure that they don't get it again. The problem with the ADE is that the person might recover. So if you give this antibody to people, then they might, first of all, just something to tell people that you might not be aware of. A vaccine is only good for people who haven't yet gotten sick. So you would only give a vaccine to someone who is currently healthy. Most people in the Western world and in the world at large, but even particularly in the Western world, are under lockdown, which means the risk of getting the infected over the next couple of weeks is extremely, extremely low. So that means that there are not a lot of people that we're going to be able to even see if they were infected or not, because if you give them the vaccine but they're on lockdown, they're not going to get infected. And you're going to need to see hundreds, perhaps thousands of people infected in these clinical trials in order to see if there's a strong signal of protection. And so that means that the longer we're under lockdown, the longer the clinical trials are going to last, because we want to have people getting sick to know if the vaccine's preventing anything. And then further, these ADEs, if they're triggering something, then you won't know until perhaps they might get infected now, but then what if they're infected a second time? And so really the course of these things, you should be tracking them not just for weeks or even a month, but if you could track them for like 6 months or a year, that would be better, because you don't want to trigger an ADE in people later on, say a year from now, where it protected them earlier on, but then it turned out if they got the vaccine that we didn't realize, but a year from now, it triggered something in the body and it made them at higher risk of dying later on. This is a serious concern that epidemiologists have, and it's something that's going to prevent a lot of antibodies from hitting the market very quickly. All right, Beck. Oh, you're on mute again. Okay, Beck.
Okay. Do you want me to read the questions, Glenn, or do you want?
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good.
That easier. Okay. So we have a question from Sharon Sitchenbaum asking, what is the relationship between COVID-19 and sepsis?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So sepsis is any type of infection. So any type of pathological infection in the body that just goes out of control. And what happens is that with COVID-19 and particularly the virus that causes it, so the SARS-CoV-2 virus, what happens is that once people start getting this advanced disease, it causes ruptures in different parts of the body. So if it impacts the lungs, then that means that there's the tissue itself starts to become necrotic and starts to get destroyed. And so when you have all these cells that are sort of leaking and you have all this damage to the tissue, then other organisms can come in and can then add on, and you sort of have these super infections where you have this other types of organisms that cause the additional problems that we're seeing in terms of pneumonia and other types of things. And so the sicker the patients get, then it causes these things. So sepsis is when these infections just run out of control, and then what happens is it causes a whole cascade of problems around the body. So then you impacts organs all over the body, and all sorts of bad things start to happen. And that is sort of not necessarily directly something that is to do with the virus itself, but could be based on these other organisms that start coming in and piggybacking in. And that's why azithromycin and some of these other drugs that are just these broad spectrum drugs to treat infections in general have sometimes been shown to be effective, because they can come in and then they are can prevent sepsis. So yeah. All right, next question, Beck. Oh wait, I have to unmute. Becky, can you raise your hand? And then we'll put you right at the top, and that'll make it easier for me to. No, raise your hand on the. All right, I'll try to find you. All right, there you are. Okay.
Okay. You might have already answered this one, but I'm going to ask it again just in case. Okay, Dan Rodriguez asked about the coronavirus task force recently mentioned that we are weeks away from widespread antibody tests. I know you spoke about the antibodies. Can you please address why these tests are important and the state of play with these tests?
Yeah, so first, okay, that's a really good point. So let me go back to tests in general. So there's basically two types of tests. And so first I'm going to start with the RNA test and then get into the antibody test. So the two tests are, one type of test looks for the virus itself. And so there's some really, really fascinating things that are being developed with the test itself for the virus rather than the antibody. The RNA test, this is testing for the virus itself. Those tests, there's three basic kinds. The first kind is called polymerase chain reaction. And that's the one that's been used around the world that people have been using. And basically the way that this works is there's these small segments of RNA. So you wouldn't test for the whole virus. Instead, you take these snapshots. It's back to thinking about the elephant that we saw before. You take these small snapshots. And so typically with this virus in particular, you take 2 or 3 different short segments of the virus, and then you look for those. And what you do is you sort of take a subset of it and then amplify it, and then take a subset of that and amplify it again. Typically for this test, you might amplify it 20, 30, 40 times, dozens and dozens of times you would amplify this. If when you amplify it, you see a positive test, then that says, okay, it's positive. If when you amplify it, you don't see a positive test, then you would say, okay, the patient is negative for this virus. The problem is that a lot of times, if people's viral load is not very high, then you might amplify it for, let's say, 30 times, and you'd say, oh, the patient's negative for it because you couldn't find the virus. But if you were to continue amplifying it, you might find a signal. And so we need some sort of standard that we apply to everyone, and that's why there's a cutoff. And this is in every viral load detection that we do. There's always a cutoff where you would say above the cutoff is do you see the virus and there's some viral load, and below that level it's undetectable. And so we would typically say that for many diseases that it's negative. All right, the reason that this takes so long, there's two reasons. One, amplifying it so many times just takes many hours to do this, days to do it in some cases, depending on the lab. And then also there's a backlog of doing all these tests. So even though it might take hours for an individual test to get the results, it could take, that's why there's this huge backlog right now. So there was an urgent need to develop rapid alternatives for finding viral load. And so the first one that's become available, this is the Abbott test that people have been talking about. Within 5 minutes, they can do this viral test. This is a different type of RNA test that was developed just for, that it came out of this epidemic itself, which is great that there's all this great science that's coming out of this. And so they say that necessity is the mother of invention. And so here we are. It's called isothermal RPA. And so this is much more rapid. It's a similar type of component in terms of looking at the in terms of identifying the RNA using just pieces of it. But I'm not going to go through the weeds in terms of anything more than that. This is a 5-minute test. This will be extremely effective, and it'll help massively help to identify the virus. So when we come out of lockdown, if this is more widespread, then this is going to be really amazing. In addition, there's CRISPR. And so this looks at specific subsets. What's unique about this, I don't think that there's currently any commercially released tests using CRISPR-Cas12 or CRISPR-Cas13, but in the lab, they're being evaluated currently. What's unique about this is that it seems like with these tests, you could almost set something and make it commercially available that is almost like a pregnancy test, where you take strips from individuals in their own house, and then you have like a pregnancy test, you could find the results in your own house. Even with this isothermal RPA, this Abbott test, you need to have these tests located in facilities, because even though it's quick, what you have to have these advanced machines that can read the test. What's different about the CRISPR Cas12 or Cas13 nucleic acid detection is that you could have like a home pregnancy test. It could be really amazing in that sense. There's nothing commercially available for the CRISPR Cas12 or Cas13 yet, but within the coming few weeks, there could be, or months. So, so this is something to look out for, really interesting. But now going on to antibodies, the problem with antibodies, I don't know if I have a good slide for this. Oh wait, I do have a slide. Let me see if I can find it. I'm just digging through. All right, this slide, I'm sorry for that, it's really hard to see, there's charts. So the problem is that the RNA can be seen much earlier in the disease. And so there's 3 things I want to point out from this graph. Even though you can't see it, I'll just speak to it. First is that each one of these lines represents a different place in which the sample was taken. From some people, they took a swab in their nose. For some, they took a swab from their spit. And from others, they took a stool sample. And what you see is that there's wide variation in being able to detect the RNA. The dotted line is below the detectable limit that would normally be used in a clinical setting. And so the problem is, depending on how they take it, you can see in some of these places, if you took a nasal swab, then it might say, oh, they're negative, they don't have any RNA. But if you took a sample from a different place, either from stool or from somewhere else, you might see the virus. So that's the first trouble, is that someone could be replicating the virus in parts of their body and it wouldn't be detected based on just the regular nasal swab. The second thing is that having the virus, it's not until days after. Look, if you look at the arrow pointing down, there's a very, very small arrow pointing down in each of these. That's the point in which the patient started having an antibody reaction. And so they started developing antibodies that could be tested in the blood. For a lot of these patients, you can see antibodies didn't develop until maybe the 10th week, the 10th day, or the 2nd week for some of these patients. And so that is really problematic in terms of looking at this, because if you do widespread antibody testing to see who may currently have the disease, a lot of people will have the disease and you won't know it. So that means we need to use RNA testing in addition to antibody testing. The benefit of antibody testing is that it tells you if someone has had the disease, not necessarily if they have active disease, but if they've had it previously and have an antibody response. A lot of people who are antibody positive and have had an antibody response will continue to have viral replication, and a lot of people will clear the virus. The problem is that you can see from these charts, viral replication continues for a while after the antibody response. It's not that you have an antibody response and suddenly within a few days, the RNA goes down. The RNA could continue for weeks after, potentially. Probably in most people, not weeks, probably in most people, a week or less, maybe 1 to 2 weeks, but it could theoretically continue for much longer. You could see that in the graphs that we have here, some of them extending out to 21 days, that's 3 weeks, that RNA was detected above the detectable limit, even at the end, in terms of when they stopped detecting people, when they stopped testing people. So this is something that's still we're trying to get a grip around. We don't know yet. The disease hasn't been around for that long. So once the problem, so there's two things. Once someone is identified as having an antibody positive test, the hope would be that the economy would suddenly be able to then come back. It could come back to life at that point, because we'd know if someone has a positive antibody test and a negative RNA test, that those people might be immune. The problem is, like I said, it's this detectable limit thing where someone could literally be undetectable for a couple of days and have a positive antibody test, and we would think that they are immune now, when in fact they could be, in some places in the literature, they're being called reactivated. It's not clear if they're being reactivated or it's just that they're continuing to have the disease, but maybe they were above the detectable limit in some parts, like say in their stool or in sputum, but then not in the swab, the nasal swab, or wherever else that they had it swabbed. This is something we're still trying to figure out. I know economically, this is going to be one of the biggest, most important questions at all. Having a positive antibody, will that tell you if you are protected from having a second course of the disease? And we don't know it yet. This worries a lot of us a little bit, knowing that there are people who do have positive antibodies, who do have negative RNA test results, but who will get it again. And so we're still trying to understand. This is still an open question. All right, Beck, let me unmute you again. All right, Becky, you're up.
So what progress, so Dan Rodriguez is asking, what progress, if any, has been made with the antibody tests? Is a few weeks away too optimistic, or where do you feel that we stand?
So remember, these antibody tests, what we're doing so far is identifying antibody candidates for testing. So when you read in the news, oh, so-and-so found this new antibody, potential antibody, it's an antibody candidate. So we still need to go through all of these weeks and months of testing. Particularly, remember, it goes back to this idea of these ADEs, sometimes pronounced AIDS, sometimes pronounced ADEs, where you don't want to trigger someone to get really sick or to potentially die from one of these ADEs. So the only way to evaluate that is literally to test it on many, many, many people over months potentially. That's why when people have been talking about antibodies, when that might become available to sort of have vaccines available, we could be talking about 12 months or longer. With the antibody test, there are multiple antibody tests that have been identified already, so that have been found, and we understand how well they work. The question is ramping them up commercially, and I'm not sure. The antibody tests, I'm assuming, depending on how much of a will there was, I haven't been tracking it closely, within the next few weeks when we start coming out of lockdown, depending on at what point that is, there should be a bunch of antibody tests commercially available. I'm highly optimistic about that. And so I don't know who it's going to come from. There's a bunch of different labs that are working on these at this point. But so they are being definitely a lot of research being done in this area. And as you can tell, so we wouldn't know from a graph like this that there was an antibody response unless there was a test to identify the antibody. So clinically at least, these have been around for months already. In terms of making them commercially available, where there's huge progress on that. There will probably be multiple, the same way that there's multiple RNA tests available, there's also multiple antibody tests that will become available. All right, Beck, I'm going to.
Okay, so the next question we have is from Theyman1. The question is, what are the medical criteria with good tests, cures, and you talked about these different antibody tests and the RNA tests. So how do you see this lockdown ending before the vaccine adoption? Is it once and for all? Is it in stages? Can you talk about where you see that going?
So test and trace is what it's all about. So basically, the reason that this virus went out of control is because we didn't have enough diagnostic tests to track it or to identify it, and we didn't have enough people who could track patients who turned out to be RNA positive to see who they were infected from and who they might have infected. And the only way to stop another outbreak is when we identify a positive test. First of all, we need to test widely, and then when we identify a positive test, we're going to have to start giving out antibody tests. The problem is that there's always going to be false positives. You want a screening test to err on the side of saying that people do have the disease than rather a false negative, which is that you have a sick person who then thinks that they're negative and goes out in the world. So if you err on the side with a screening test, let's say it's something like prostate cancer, there's always going to be an early screening test that has false positives in it. And then what you do with say prostate cancer is then you would go and have a biopsy or have another test that's much more specific, so you can rule out if it was just a false positive. If a test is, say, 5% of them are false positives, then if you give this test to 100 million people and 5% are false positive, then that means you're going to have, just based on the test itself, you know you're going to have 5 million false positives. These are people walking around who don't have the disease, but think that they do, and you're going to have to trigger your whole tracking system to try to see who they might have gotten it from, who they might have given it to, even if it turns out all those millions of people were dead ends. So that means we need to have an army of people doing this tracking and tracing, because that's the only way for us to address all of these people, including the false positives and the real positives who are out there, to try to prevent it. If we have enough diagnostic tests and we have an army of tracking people out there, then we'll be able to catch most cases as they come up, and then we won't have to worry about having another outbreak. This is what South Korea has been doing so effectively, as well as additional countries more recently. Singapore, China has been good at this. A lot of the countries that are really successful right now are really implementing this, the diagnostic testing and the tracking. They've been extremely effective. And so that's what we need to do here. If we open the doors without having our testing and tracing up to like we have an army of people. Here, wait 1 sec, whoops. I need to, give me 1 sec. All right, but Beth, before I go on to you, so I saw one question. What do we need to have to be a tracer? So the problem is we have no really good federal system in place for almost any of this. Like, so if anything you might hear on the news, if Trump says, oh, he hopes the economy is going to be open by such and such a date, ignore it. He has zero influence even at this point. Right now, at least I sit in New Jersey. This lockdown came from the governor of New Jersey, and the governor of New Jersey gets to decide when this opens up. In New York, it's the governor of New York. And so the president really has a very limited ability to even have influence. Forget about control. He can't even influence things anymore. So basically the question is, when will the governor of New Jersey release lockdown? When will New York and New York City release lockdown? Because the public health response is now taking place mostly at the state and local level, then it's all this people at the state and local level that are hiring this army of people who are going to be tracing, because they all need to be trained. You can imagine this is very sensitive health information. So you can't just bring anyone on board who has a good heart. You need to really identify people who have no criminal background and so you really have to bring people on board. It's a whole process to bring these people on board who could be trained. So this is something Massachusetts already announced, I think it was this past week, that they've set up this army of tracers, and they have, I think, over 1,000 people that they've already are starting training to be tracers in their state. I'm assuming that most states like New Jersey, New York, et cetera, that are really have been proactive in this stuff, I'm assuming that they're working right now in similar ends. We just haven't heard about it in the news yet. But right now, as far as I know, there's not a federal system in place to get these tracers in place. All right, Beck, let me unmute. Nope, that didn't do it. All right, Beck, nope. All right, Beck, you're on.
Okay. Those are all the questions that I have from the audience. If anyone has any other questions.
We're running a little bit late, but there's something I'd really like to talk to, because as an epidemiologist, I find it really intriguing. And that's the tuberculosis vaccine. So I'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so here's an intro. Oh no, let me come back. All right, so there's this vaccine called the BCG vaccine that was used for tuberculosis. It's been around for, I think, 100 years now, give or take. And it was developed, I think, maybe even over 100 years ago. It started being used more commonly in the 1940s, 1950s. And so if you look at, these are all, what we're looking at here are countries where this BCG vaccine has been used. In green, there's only a few of us in green, United States and Canada. We've never had a universal vaccination policy for BCG because we've never had a tuberculosis problem in this country that required one. In other countries, if you look at this, well, that's not this one. In other countries, this is 1980. You can see in 1980 already, so that was, it's hard to believe that was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, there was already widespread vaccination programs in many parts of the world against tuberculosis using this BCG vaccine. So people in 1980 who were 1-year-olds then would be roughly 40 years old now, give or take, depending on their birthday. So let's call them 40-year-olds. These 40-year-olds would be would have had this BCG vaccine. Typically, a vaccine like this diminishes over time, but a lot of people with the BCG vaccine, even at 40 years old, if you give them a tuberculosis skin test, they'll still test positive for that, which means that there still could be an immune memory, that there could still be something going on. If you look more recently, this is 1980, if you look more recently in 2000, it's even more widespread. And so what's interesting is that two things are interesting that people have been finding. One thing that people have been noticing for 10, 20 years now is that what's interesting about the tuberculosis vaccine, about the BCG, is it doesn't seem to be effective just against tuberculosis. It seems to also be effective against a wide number of respiratory diseases, pardon me, including things like a wide variety. So things that just causes colds, it protects against leprosy, against all these different things that are out there. And so people have been saying, well, what if there's a protection from this BCG vaccine for coronavirus? The advantage of this is that this is already widespread. And so if it's already out there, we wouldn't have to do so much new testing because it's not a new vaccine where you'd have to worry about an ADE. So we're not talking about something that would be available in 1 year or 18 months. Instead, we're looking at something that could be available in 6 months, potentially less. And so one of the classic epidemiology design would say, okay, at a high level, we have enough data already. Take a look at these countries out there. Some countries are dark blue, some countries are lighter blue. Overlay that map with the map of the COVID-19 disease, of SARS-CoV-2. And studies have already started being published that have looked at this. And what they found is that, lo and behold, the ones without the vaccine cluster up in the right, that they're the ones who have the highest SARS-CoV-2. In fact, on average, what we found is that the ones with no vaccine for tuberculosis are 10 times more likely to have people in their population infected, and 10 times more likely for there to be to die, for the patients who have SARS-CoV-2 to die from it. 10 times, that's huge. It's still correlation though. And so if you see that the correlation is extremely strong. And so what this means is that this is, a lot of epidemiologists are looking at this and saying, holy cow, this is huge. It's still correlation, so we don't know. But we know that if it if it works, you don't have to worry about the safety thing as much because we already know what the safety profile looks like. So right now there's a massive amount of clinical trials that are going on. Not so many individual clinical trials, but they're recruiting thousands of people around the world to now see, is it too late? Can we start giving out the BCG vaccine to adults? Usually it's given to infants. Does it work if it's given to adults? Does it work if we give it to healthcare providers? Because these are some of the highest risk of developing COVID-19. And so right now there's an army of clinicians out there who are doing this type of clinical trial. And I hope that this works, because if this works, then this would be one of the earliest vaccines, because like a normal vaccine would take many, many months. If this works, then this would be something we would see in the 3 to 6 month time frame potentially in terms of seeing readouts on that. So I'm optimistic about this. But like I say, based on these trials, you don't know. You have to run through it. And right now, this correlation is only a correlation. The one beneficial thing about this is that the BCG vaccine is probably an indicator. It's a marker rather than the vaccine itself, because you know that countries that had the BCG vaccine, even if there weren't a lot of vaccines early on in the 80s, the reason that there was a vaccination program at all is because there was tuberculosis that was there just on its own. It was endemic to the area. And frequently in a lot of those areas, there might have been other diseases, maybe colds or other infections that also might be protective against SARS-CoV-2. Interestingly, if you look at Africa, which does have more tuberculosis, a lot of us were worried that there would be a much heavier burden of disease with COVID-19 in Africa. We're not seeing it a lot right now. And it could be one explanation in some of these other diseases, some of these other countries too that we're looking at. One of these countries, one of these hypotheses is that people could have been infected as kids with these other diseases, whether they got the vaccine or not, and that is conferring protection from SARS-CoV-2. And so this is a really intriguing area that we're looking on that's still evolving. But it's just when you look at something and there's a 10 times, and that's an order of magnitude difference in protection, that is really intriguing. And that's just an area of interest of mine. Obviously, we don't know yet if it's going to actually be protective when we start with what these trials will look like. But the one problem in the United States is that it's not manufactured heavily here, because we haven't had a universal vaccination policy for this BCG vaccine in the United States. It's very, very common in other parts of the world to be able to find this vaccine. A lot of people born abroad will have this characteristic scar mark on one of their arms, because it typically leaves a scar like the polio vaccine did. And so a lot of people born abroad will have this. And if it's effective, then they could have protection from it. But in the United States, it could be extremely hard to find, and ramping up that manufacturing capacity could be a little tricky. We might have to import that, and I'm not sure what that would look like. All right, I've run over time a little bit. Are there any questions on what I've talked about so far? Please write it in chat if you do, and I'll give it to Becky to, okay.
It looks like we've got some questions about these tracing apps that are being used in China and South Korea. And do we anticipate perhaps some of that technology being used here? And are there perhaps going to be some major fights over privacy versus protecting the general public?
Yeah, the problem with that is that, so South Korea and China, as they can just decree that everyone will be traced, and that is sufficient, and then they can do it. Here, Trump could decree something like that, but it's unlikely that that would happen because of privacy rules. So what that means is that most likely people would need to opt in to let their data be revealed in terms of being traced when they're walking around. And the problem was, whenever you have an opt-in program, is that typically the ones who are least likely to opt in are also the ones who are least likely to wear the mask when they go outside, or follow social distancing, or to follow rules in general, maybe. And so the problem is that the ones who are most likely to either be infected or to be at the highest risk of getting infected and maybe being asymptomatic and not even knowing it, those are the very ones who are the least likely to opt in. So we're going to have to see how this as a policy comes into play, but it could be something that works effectively. I just don't know whether it's going to be an opt-in program or not. Some of this stuff can be done anonymously, but it'll be a tricky thing to connect a patient who's sick versus just knowing where there's activity. Right now, some of this early data has been really good at just showing where there's movement. So we've had these lockdowns, and I know in the early days of the lockdowns, there were these really great maps where you could see a lot of activity in parts of the country and very little activity on the coast because of the lockdown. So you could see that the lockdown was effective in preventing movement. But other than that, it's hard to know. For me, I'm more interested in seeing antibody test sampling. So not necessarily knowing what individual has antibodies per se, but knowing what areas are antibody positive, because then that could help you to look for hotspots in different areas and where you would focus your army of additional testers, as opposed to areas where maybe they don't have very many antibody tests at all. The flip side of that is if there's not a lot of antibody, then it means that the people who live there might be at higher risk for getting it if they haven't previously been exposed. There still is this idea that we're not quite sure if having an antibody response will prevent you from getting it. Most of us are assuming, yes, if you have a strong antibody response, it will prevent you from getting infected again. The problem is when you look at SARS and MERS, which are cousins of the COVID-19 or cousins of SARS, of the SARS-CoV-2, some of the protection doesn't last very long. For some, it might last weeks or months. For others, it might last only a few years. So we don't know how long that protection might last. So even if someone does have an antibody response, we don't know how long that'll last. So, you know, maybe if we're talking about what does the next 6 months look like, that might be very different than what the next year looks like, depending on how this all plays out. We just don't know yet. All right, Beck, let me unmute you. Okay.
So those are the questions that we have so far. I think another question that probably a lot of people are wondering is, when can we expect and hope for another fireside chat with you again?
I can do one next weekend if there's anything interesting to talk about. I mean, it seems, I don't know about you, but we've been in lockdown for like 3 or 4 weeks in New Jersey, and it seems in some ways like 3 or 4 months. But so the problem is, so data is coming out really fast, but it's literally only a week or 2 that we're talking about. And it's hard to accumulate a lot of new information in that time. I can put an hour for sure on for next Sunday. So we can do that if people are interested.
I think folks would be really appreciative of that. And as we know, a lot of information comes out daily, sometimes conflicting information. And so being able to reconvene next Sunday would be great.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. And hopefully some of the stuff I've told you now will be outdated and we'll have really good information, and that will help us. But right now, we don't know. The one thing as we part that I'll show you is this one thing. So this is a pangolin. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. But so this is the species so the virus evolved in bats. And then it jumped from bats to pangolins, and that's what enabled it to infect people. So it didn't come directly from bats to people. The people could touch the bats and there was no problem at all. It couldn't replicate in people. But apparently, by taking the bat virus and then infecting the pangolin, that's what caused it to mutate in such a way that it could then infect people. And so this animal that many of us have never even heard of before, this is what's caused the global pandemic that we're seeing in people around the world. This animal. Not this one in particular, but this species that I had never even heard of before. So the pangolin. So and the other thing is we are at risk. Like this virus, there's many other viruses out there. So we do need to increase our pandemic preparedness because there's all sorts of potential future pandemics that we need to get ahead of in the future. But so having said that, thanks everyone for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. All right, thank you.